So to reorient you to where we're at, we were walking through a discussion of specific school-based intervention strategies as a function of different mediators for treatment. We had talked about teachers mediating intervention, the combination of parents and teachers mediating intervention, peers, and the use of computer technology. Another potential mediator, of course, is the target student, him or herself. And this is referred to in the literature as self-monitoring, self-evaluation, self-reinforcement, or self-management. There's kind of the self-management's kind of the umbrella term. And you'll hear more recently the term self-regulated intervention. They're basically talking about the same type of strategy, which is to train students with ADHD to monitor, evaluate, and or reinforce their own behavior. And if you think about that, that's kind of the, if you will, the holy grail of ADHD treatment is for the students themselves to manage their own behavior. Because at its roots, ADHD is a disorder of self-regulation or lack thereof. And so if we can train students to engage in self-regulation, we've really hit at the core of what ADHD is all about. And clearly, to the extent that kids can manage their own interventions, it's going to be much more feasible and acceptable from the point of view of the teacher or other adults, because the student themselves is managing the intervention. So there's a lot of promise to it. There's a lot of good reason to focus on this. The challenge has been to hit on self-regulated or self-management interventions that actually work. Historically, some of the first attempts here in this area have been to train kids to think aloud, to engage in cognitive problem solving or social problem solving strategies. And those treatments worked in the context of the therapy session or the counseling session, but had much more limited impact on real world settings, behavior in real world settings like the playground, the classroom, the neighborhood, or whatever. In other words, the kids were able to demonstrate this think aloud problem solving strategy in the presence of an adult therapist, but those skills did not transfer readily to real-world settings. So the more recent focus in this area has been on training strategies in situ, in the environment where the behavior is happening. Sometimes referred to as the point of performance. That setting and that time when the key behavior is supposed to happen. So training self-management at the point of performance is really where it's at right now, as opposed to training self-management and problem solving and cognitive skills in a separate environment at a separate time from the problem of interest. So if we're interested in changing behavior in math class, and that class happens at 9 a.m. Monday through Friday, then the best intervention and the best directed intervention in terms of self-management is going to happen Monday through Friday at 9 a.m. in the math class, not at 3 p.m. in the counselor's office on a Thursday. Okay, so we're trying to intervene and focus on self-management at the point of performance, at the time when the behavior is supposed to occur. So some of the attempts here to work with students with ADHD have been focused on self-monitoring of their behavior, and others have been directed at self-evaluation. So let me give you some examples of each. Self-monitoring, I have up here self-monitoring of organizational skills, and we're going to walk through that. But historically, some of the simplest self-monitoring programs have been focused on helping students to monitor their own attention, their own completion of work, and or the accuracy of work. So in that context, what happens is a student is given a checklist prior to a particular task, remembering that independent work is a frequent trigger for the disruptive behavior of these kids. So when you're giving that work, they have a checklist that at the top says, am I on task? Or am I paying attention? Kids don't use the word on task. Okay, so am I paying attention? And there's one column that's titled yes, and one column that's titled no. And at times when they are cued, and we'll talk about that in a minute, when they are cued, the student simply gauges whether they're paying attention or not. And if they feel that they are, they put a check in the yes column. If they feel they weren't, they put a check in the no column. Now, this can be cued in a number of different ways. There could be timers that are set that go off at prescribed intervals after a few minutes or whatever. There's also a contraption called a motivator. I don't know if anybody has seen that. Anybody heard of the motivator? It's like like this kind of, I have a cell phone here, but like, the old style beeper kind of technology that's put on your belt loop and is set up to vibrate at certain intervals as a cue to the individual to do something. And it's been used in like smoking reduction studies with adults and other things along those lines. But the motivator could be used in self-monitoring where you set it up to go off every few minutes or even on a variable schedule. And whenever it vibrates, you need to look at your checklist. Was I paying attention? Yes. Was I paying attention? No. And you're going forward with that. Now, you can do variations of this where you're monitoring how much work you complete, how accurate your work is. What they found is that with milder ADHD kids, this self-monitoring, just paying attention to your own behavior in a cued way can actually change behavior. And if you think about it yourself, if you're trying to change something in your own life, the more you pay attention to it, at least initially, there's a reactive change to that. Just by monitoring alone, behavior can change. The challenge is that's really, that can be effective for milder ADHD kids. Some question as to its efficacy with more severe ADHD or ADHD with more conduct problems. This monitoring alone may not be sufficient because there's kind of a minimal motivational component and a minimal check on the accuracy of their own monitoring. Now, a variation of this we've done, so some students and I have done in terms of looking at adolescents with ADHD with respect to organizational skills, being ready for class. Many of these students come to class unprepared. They don't have a pencil or a pen. They don't have the right notebook. They don't have the right textbook. They're not in their seat when the bell rings, all those kinds of things. So what we did in a couple of studies is we trained students, and these were middle school students with ADHD. We generated a list of what they should be doing in terms of class preparation with the teacher. The teacher and us, we designed a list of, okay, here are the 5 things that have to happen in preparation for class. And initially, the student and the teacher independently completed this checklist. And we trained the student to monitor his or her own organizational being prepared for class. And that's a pretty quick training. It's really pretty straightforward in terms of each of these criteria. You either have a pen or a pencil or you don't. It's not really all that cumbersome to train. And then what we did is, over time, we faded the contact. There was a contact with a school psychologist each morning to kind of go over this list, and at the end of the day, just to see how they did in terms of preparation for class. Just a couple minutes beginning of the day, a couple minutes at the end of the day. And then that was faded out. School psychologist faded out. And actually the self-monitoring checklist was faded out over time as well. And what we found is that this was with 3 7th grade students with ADHD, the first study, that they went to 100% criteria in terms of class preparation pretty quickly with the self-monitoring, and that maintained once we removed the school psychologist and the checklist. So in other words, they, just internally running through the things they needed to do to be prepared. And then we replicated that study with 6 more middle school students and included homework performance on there too. So there was a parent monitoring component as well with this, and again found increases to the 100% level in terms of classroom preparation, including having your homework ready to turn in. And these were, again, students with ADHD, met criteria for ADHD at the middle school level, some of whom were on medication, some of whom weren't. The medication piece didn't really make too big of an impact. So that's one example of applying this kind of self-monitoring approach to organizational skills. The other self-management program that I want to talk about is really more in the self-evaluation domain. And this is a program that was originally developed back in the early 80s by Rode, Morgan, and Young up in Utah. And I gave you the reference on your resource list for this. But we've used this pretty successfully with students with ADHD, particularly students with ADHD who are already experienced on a classroom management program. So in other words, they're on a token program of some kind where they're already earning points. And this self-evaluation program is a nice way to wean them out of the external piece of this. In other words, we're going to move to a system with this where the child themselves, the student themselves, is really evaluating what they're doing rather than the teacher. So what's involved here is a pretty straightforward process where the teacher and the student independently grade the student's performance on a set of criteria for a specific period of time. Let me give you some example criteria. You see here from 0 to 5. And these criteria need to be individualized for the students that you would work with, obviously. But we're ranging from 0 to 5. And you can see how these are lined up in terms of adherence to the rules and getting work done. Both of those are anchor points for these criteria. So what happens is at the end of a given time period, let's say at the end of an academic period, the teacher and the student grade the student's performance using these criteria, and they do that independently. And then they compare their scores. Okay? Now, what happens is, if the student's score is within 1 point of the teacher's, then the student keeps the points he or she gave him or herself. Okay? So, for example, if I'm the student and I give myself a 3, and you're the teacher and you give me a 2, because I'm within 1 point of your rating, I get to keep the 3 points I gave myself. Okay? If I am more than 1 point away from your rating, if the student is more than 1 point away from the teacher's rating, he or she gets 0 points. Not even the points that the teacher would have given them. So, for example, if I give myself a 3, teacher gives me a 1, I don't get any points. Right? Because I'm too different from the teacher's rating. And there's a third possibility. I could exactly match the teacher's ratings as a student. So I could give myself a 3, teacher gives me a 3. In that case, I get a bonus point for matching the teacher. So I get the 3 points that I gave myself because I'm within 1 point, right, of the teacher. And because I exactly matched, I get a bonus point for a total of 4. So what's happening with that is we are reinforcing 2 things here using these points. One is we're trying to reinforce the the attainment of these goals here. Okay, we're trying to get kids to follow rules and get their work done accurately. And by providing the bonus points, we are reinforcing the student for looking at their behavior from the point of view of the teacher. And as you might imagine, for kids with ADHD, to look at their behavior from the point of view of another person, particularly an adult person, is not an easy thing. It's not something they're used to doing. But it's an important part of maturing in terms of self-regulation. Okay, so we're reinforcing better performance, and we're reinforcing looking at one's behavior from the point of view of an adult authority figure. Everybody with me so far on that? Okay, now this is not self-management at this point. This is simply a token system with a little twist in the sense that the points represent tokens, immediate reinforcers that you exchange later for backup reinforcers, as we talked about this morning. And we've added an opportunity for bonus points, and we've put in a penalty, in essence, for not being close to the teacher's ratings. That's the difference so far. It's not self-management. In order to move to self-management, we have to remove the teacher from the rating business. In other words, we have to move to the point where the student, him or herself, is totally evaluating their own performance on their own. Now, I can tell you that if we had a successful system where kids were matching pretty well, and we stopped that cold turkey and removed the teacher all at once from the rating part of this and the matching part of this, what do you think would happen to behavior of the student? You'd go back to baseline, right? It would be, probably wouldn't maintain at whatever level we had built it up to. So what Rode, Morgan, and Young did, and others since then, is a gradual process of weaning the teacher's ratings out of the picture. And they actually set it up as almost a lottery in terms of how that would happen. Let me give you a simple example. Let's say that we start with this system and we have a 100% match condition, which is where at the end of each period, myself and the teacher, we have to compare ratings, and in order to earn the points, I've got to be within 1 point of the teacher, or I earn a bonus, whatever, just as I described, 100% of the time. And let's say we get behavior up to a pretty good level where the kid is receiving mostly 4s and 5s on the previous criteria that I showed you. What we would go to next is a random periodic matching challenge condition where we would set up various odds that you would have to match the teacher. Simple example, end of the academic period, we flip a coin. Heads, we have to match, as we've been discussing. Tails, you don't have to compare to your teacher ratings. You get to keep the points you gave yourself and walk away, no matter what the teacher gave you. It's random. You don't know a priori, neither the teacher nor the student know ahead of time whether they're going to have to match or not. It's a 50-50 chance. Now, what Rode, Morgan, and Young did is they actually started with a 75% matching challenge, then went to 50, then went to 25, then went to 0. But you can set up whatever odds you want using slips of paper in terms of what numbers are hot in terms of a match and what numbers are not. You can set up whatever odds you want to set up. But the point is you gradually, through this random process, remove the need to match the teacher. To the point where when you get to a 0% match condition, the student is evaluating him or herself totally on their own. And then the next step is to take the written piece out, as we did with the self-monitoring program, and now they're just, internally, presumably, going through that evaluation process. And Rode, Morgan, and Young in their seminal study showed nice effects on kids with disruptive behavior. They were working with older elementary students with behavior disorders, not necessarily ADHD per se, but there have been several studies since then that have focused primarily on ADHD kids, advanced elementary and middle school students with ADHD, using this matching game as a self-evaluation paradigm. As you might imagine, some kids go quicker through this than others. I've worked with some students where they move pretty rapidly to self-management, particularly if they have milder ADHD, older, a little bit more mature, and they have had success with a token program or something similar. And they can move pretty rapidly. Other kids, younger kids, ones that are more severe, ones who may not have had as much experience successfully with a behavior management program, they might go in fits and starts where they do pretty well with this. You start to fade the teacher out, and their behavior starts to go downhill. And they inflate their ratings, they overinflate what they give themselves, and that's a signal that you need to go back to more frequent teacher matches. And so there's this kind of 2 steps forward, 1 step back, 2 steps forward, 1 step back kind of process down the continuum towards self-management. And sometimes that takes weeks and months. For some kids, it may even be across school years. But the overall objective, really, is to move a kid to a more self-regulated, self-managed position. And if we can even move kids along that continuum to some degree so that they're not totally externally managed, that's still a benefit. Let me stop here. Questions, comments? Anybody who's tried anything similar to this? Yes?
You did with the 6 students.
Yes.
You did that in an individual basis.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what
You're talking about the self-monitoring of organizational skills? Yeah.
So you suggest, maybe doing it every day. Do you think it could work in little groups of 4 just because of time management? I have 56 kids and...
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the question, I don't know if everybody heard that question, but just referring back to the self-monitoring, this one here, that the 6 students that we worked with in the Gresco-Moore et al. 2007 study, those were individual students that met individually with their school psychologist briefly in the morning and briefly in the afternoon. The question is, could this be done in a small group format? I don't see any reason why it couldn't. In fact, there could be perhaps even some peer pressure to some degree to do better as a group. You could even build that in if you wanted to. We haven't done that, but in a large program that's where you want to build in efficiency, I don't see any reason why you couldn't. What we're going to do now is I've been really talking at you pretty long here, and I think it's really important to gauge where you're at and what you're thinking about this. And I think one way we can do this, I gave you as a handout some case examples. And it's on the handout titled Case Examples for Discussion. The first case being Greg, age 7. That's the handout I'm referring to. Does everybody have that? Yes? Nobody's missing it. Okay. So there are 3 cases on this handout. And what I'd like to do is have you guys break up into smaller groups, let's say 4 or 5 in a group. And choose a case, but actually what I'll do is maybe once you get in your groups, I'll go through and tell you which one to do, just to make sure we get all 3 cases in, so that not everybody chooses the one case. But what I'd like you to do is what's up here on the slide, it's also on your handout, is based on this description of each case, what are 3 goals that you would design for a school-based intervention for that student? So 3 goals. Secondly, design a balanced intervention plan. Remember what I'm talking about with balance. Proactive, preventive, combined with instructive potentially, and motivational. Multiple mediators, so more than 1 mediator. It doesn't have to be all 5 that we've talked about, but more than 1. And then talk about how you're going to evaluate that treatment plan. What is it that you're going to do to make sure that that's working? Okay, so 3 things: goals, balanced plan with multiple mediators, and how you're going to evaluate it. Now, these descriptions in here are not complete. Make stuff up. Okay? So if you need some information in terms of a case, just as a group agree on whatever that is that's missing and agree to go with it. The point is not to solve this case. The point is really to engage us in thinking through the process of developing goals, plans, and evaluation. Okay, so everybody clear on that? Questions on that? Okay, so what I'd like you to do is maybe form the groups, again, 4 or 5, not really big, not really small, if we can. We're going to come back as a large group and discuss them. But once you get formed in your groups, I'll let you know which case example you need to think about. Thanks. What I want to do at this point is, I realize that some groups are kind of got through the steps, others are still working their way through, but just in terms of keeping us going a little bit here, what I wanted to do was just check in with each group to see where we're at in terms of developing a plan and how we're going to evaluate it, and look for also the commonalities across the groups and some of the variety of ideas that you all may have come up with, and then also talk about maybe some of the challenges that you might expect with these cases. I'm sure you've worked with kids that have similar backgrounds, similar difficulties to these examples. So why don't we start with those groups that looked at Greg, the first case, the 7-year-old. And this is kind of a classic case of a student who probably has ADHD, what's referred to as ADHD combined type, as he has difficulties in all 3 areas of ADHD symptomology, attention, impulsivity, and hyperactivity, and is having difficulties both at school and at home, socially in particular, and academically having some difficulties getting work done. So this is kind of a classic description of an elementary age boy with ADHD combined type. And so what I'd like to do is check in with each of the groups that we're discussing Greg, and first of all talk about what are some of the goals that you guys prioritized. So who are the groups that had Greg? Okay, well, we'll start with you guys. What were the goals that you came up with for Greg?
One of the goals that we came up with was to increase his social skills,
Okay.
his peers, impulsivity, and to increase his attention span.
Okay, what was the second one?
Impulsivity.
Like, what was the goal related to
To
that?
remain in his seat during group activities.
Okay, so
The intention was to have him complete his independent work.
complete his independent work. And the first one was the social skills. So how would we, what were the specifics, what would be the specific social skills? I realize it's not all in this case here, but like what, if we're going to say you want to increase your social skills, what is it that we'd be looking for operationally?
Being able to take turns, with his peers, not interrupting others,
Okay.
not interrupting others, just work on his maturity.
Okay, all right, so by the way, the not interrupting others, is there a way that we could phrase that? Because that's, remember the dead person's rule, right? So there's a not in there, so it's the absence of a behavior. What would be the positive variant of that? Turn taking, which you also mentioned. Listen to others, yes. So there may be some other, you would just want to think about what are some positive alternatives to that. So you guys highlighted a goal related to social behavior, one related to impulsivity, activity level, and one related to attention, and trying to operationally define each of those. Where's another group that worked with Greg? Okay.
We were, I guess, on the same page, increasing positive social interactions.
Okay, increase positive social interactions,
On-task behavior,
increase on-task behavior.
and at the interaction, we're like trying with the rules, both the rules and the
We'll get to intervention. But what was the last one?
Increase on task behavior. Promote better behavior.
Promote better behavior. What would be, what's that?
Turn taking, following the rules, staying the same.
Okay, so some similarities with the other group. What other group was working with Greg? Anybody else? Yes. So what are the goals that I know you guys spent considerable time on the goals.
We couldn't decide if Greg was in the right grade or not, but Greg has been like this since kindergarten. So we are concerned, or at least I'm concerned, that Greg is slipping down the road there.
Right.
And he's starting to misbehave at homeworks, and poor teacher doesn't know what to do. So we thought we'd identify triggers for disruptive behavior. And we would work on Greg's social skills and attentiveness, and then have him create a self-monitoring plan, as 7-year-olds do that. Hopefully to get him back on some kind of track.
So the goals that you were specifically looking at were, I know you said identifying triggers, but that's not necessarily a goal for him, that's a goal for your group, right?
Yeah, but we wanted him to see, when everybody else was sitting down, something happened to make him run about.
Okay.
Yeah, so he could see that.
Oh, I see, so that he could recognize the
Yeah.
triggers for his own behavior.
Exactly.
Oh, that's interesting, okay.
Because we know what he's doing, but he doesn't know
All
it.
right, so one goal is to help him to recognize the triggers for his own challenging
The
behavior.
thing that happens right before he's in trouble.
Okay.
Before he loses it.
And what was the second goal?
What we say, I think it was the other goal as well. Increase social skills, because we think he's saying, see me, see me, see me. Increases social skills and attentiveness. I'm ADHD, please, so you have to forgive me.
So what would we be looking at the same, because we have a similar goal from another group in terms of increasing social skills. What social skills would you guys be focusing on?
His
Communication.
interaction with his peers,
Right.
Okay,
listening skills.
What else did you say?
His ability to work very mutually with his peers.
I didn't catch
His
those.
ability to work very mutually with his peers.
Okay, so the mutual cooperation, and then there was attentiveness, you said was the third?
Attentiveness, yes.
And so how would we operationalize that? What would
Well,
we do?
after we got Greg to see what the triggers were, we'd know why he doesn't listen, why he's never quite in the, he's not present. When he's asked to listen and do an independent task, he's off on a tangent there. And so,
Basically, we summed it up in his own words. I'm just going
Yeah,
to summarize
say what
what
you
you said. And this is what the goals were. I will improve my attention span. I would like to I would like to increase the frequency of positive behaviors and social interactions. And I need to use delayed gratification in decision making.
so we argued about Greg's vocabulary.
Right.
But in the broad picture, that was it. And then the interventions were on the 3 levels.
Okay, we're going to come back to that. But just in terms of the goals too, of course, the next step in any of these goals, and of course, you're dealing with pretty minimal information. You don't have assessment data in front of you. But just as a reminder, you would want to operationalize those in some quantifiable way, in some observable way, so that you could evaluate the outcome, which we're going to talk about a little bit later. But so, for example, with any of these goals, in terms of increasing attentiveness, for example, one would want to come up with some kind of operational definition of what that means and also some quantity. So it would be maybe something along the lines of, you could even tie it to completion of work, where you could say, the goal is completion of 80% of assigned work, something along those lines. I'm not saying you would do that in this specific case, but you would want to come up with something that was observable and quantifiable building off of these goals. But it sounds like we have some common elements in terms of what each group working with Greg went after. Were there any, those were all the groups working with Greg, right? Okay, so let's come back to the next step, which was a balanced intervention plan, meaning you have proactive and motivational and perhaps instructional in there, and more than one mediator. So we'll go back to the first group that reported in.
For proactive, we were between 2 to get him to complete his assignments for attention with workload adjustment. I'm gonna modify it for him and choice making for independent work.
Okay,
For instructive, due to the fact that he is 7 years old, direct instruction would be most appropriate for him.
direct instruction in,
Oh, that's for the, what is that?
The social, we were saying, you know, to do maybe direct instruction for the social skills as far as he's having difficulty with friends, so maybe the teacher can model what appropriate behavior would look like with his friends in turn taking.
okay,
And for motivation, it was token reinforcement, of doing it how they explained in AM and starting again. Yeah.
okay, so token reinforcement for which of the goals? To address all three of those behavioral goals, or which ones would you be targeting with the token reinforcement?
It would be, I guess, the impulsivity, staying in seat,
Mhm.
and completing his independent work.
Okay.
That would be token reinforcement.
Now, those are, how many, those are mostly teacher mediated, right?
We, but then again, also to have
Parent
involvement
involvement in the token reinforcement.
So there would be, what, some home-based contingencies for
Well, if
meeting
he-
goals at school?
his, well, that's gonna kind of skip into number 3, but having a parent-teacher daily report card, so if parent gets and sees that his behaviors were appropriate that day, then some token reinforcement from at home.
Okay,
Or positive reinforcement where if he does complete his, homework, then he can get the reward afterwards.
okay. All right, so there's parent involvement then, so it's not all the teacher, okay. And you have proactive, instructive, and motivation. Okay, good. All right, that, what about you guys?
Well, instructed with rules, just, teaching the rules, making sure that he's have him on the desk,
Mhm.
that way,
So the posting of rules and the reinforcement of rules, okay?
Then, a daily point sheet with, parent collaboration with the reinforcement. Peer tutoring, that way he can get his, attention from the individual. And then, workload modification.
Okay. All right, so you have some proactive interventions in terms of the workload adjustment and the posting of rules. And that also is directly related to goals around completion of work and social behavior. You mentioned parent, home-based contingencies via the parent for a point system.
Yeah, there is like a sheet.
Okay, so it would be a daily report card
A daily
system?
report card, and it will be addressing, task completion, following rules, and, the social aspect.
The goals that you had set would be part of the daily report card goals, okay? And what was the other one? Peer tutoring.
The peer
Now, what would peer tutoring,
tutoring.
what goals would that be
So
addressing?
to minimize the, acting silly and being the class clown, by getting, attention, positive attention from the students.
Okay, so trying to look at if peer attention is a function for some of the inappropriate social behaviors, here we have a context to engage in appropriate social behavior around academics in order to get peer attention, okay? And it may also address getting work done, right? I mean, if you have this peer tutoring, at least taking the place of some of the independent seat work, it might help with that. Was that it? Those were the components, right? Okay. How about you guys, in terms of intervention? You mentioned self-monitoring earlier.
We had decided on doing a DRC for the child.
Okay, so daily report card?
Yeah, and so having, I guess the goals we talked about specifically earlier, we'll have some of those in there. And I guess they would have to, you could do reinforcement at home or at school. They'd have to take them to the parent.
So it'd be both school-based reinforcement, so it'd be in part a point system or token system in the school, backed up with a daily report card with home-based contingencies.
Absolutely.
Okay?
I'm not sure what else.
And for the proactive part of it, we decided that there was going to be a meeting between the parent, the teacher, and the child, and Greg gets a chance to really throw in his input
Okay.
into, the formation of rules. And then they would also model behaviors to him, but modeling not only as showing him what to do, but also taking out pictures of what's an organized act, just like the example you gave us.
Okay, good. So that actually is more in an instructive domain than a preventive domain. I mean, what would be some things, well, you also talked about didn't you mention self-monitoring earlier?
Yeah,
Or no?
by
Maybe I-
getting to identify his triggers, then he could do that little checklist. Every time he stayed in his seat, he'd give himself and that could be part of the reward for positive behaviors.
Okay.
Saying we're like, we're still in staffing.
We're still in the planning stage, I understand. And I think if you were able to, along with him, I think it's kind of interesting to have him involved in
We
this. It's a
wanted
good
him
idea.
in it, yeah.
But if you have him helping to identify the triggers for his own challenging behavior, that could lead to some preventive interventions once you've identified those, and that might, also help in terms of building up that portion of the plan. Yes?
One method that we did come up for preventative measures was posting the rules, definitely making sure that the rules are posted in the classroom and reviewed, and also perhaps even having him put together his own rules, his own personal rules, and then having them on his desk both for classroom and for social skills, because we felt like that was an area that he needed assistance with, and then also even coming up with rules at home with his family.
Okay. So what you're saying is there would be class-wide rules that would be taught and reinforced. There would be individual rules perhaps related to the goals that you identified for him
On his desk.
that might get tied to the point system in particular, and then home-based rules that presumably might have some consistency with the school rules.
Right.
Because then he would take responsibilities for what he needs to work on,
Right.
not what everybody else is telling him to work on.
Right. And a very empowering approach.
Okay.
Right.
Good, okay. So interesting, we have three groups. There are certainly some common elements in terms of the goals and the interventions, but also some differences in terms of particularly some of the specific intervention plans. The last thing, and then we'll move on to the other groups, I promise, I just want to make sure we walk through each case thoroughly, is evaluation plan. I don't know if you all got to that, but how would you evaluate whether the intervention plan was working? Yeah, go ahead. You can
One of
start.
the things that we have just started, not finished this part totally, but self-reports I think really work awesome, and especially when it's done collectively. For the child to say how he did against all those standards that he has set for himself along with his teacher and his parents. And then the parents and the teacher also give him feedback as to what they think, how he did. In that way, I think it kills more than more than one bird at a time, because it also stops that lying. It's not very uncommon that sometimes they get in a habit of lying.
So you would ask each stakeholder, if you will, if you think about the parents, the teachers, the students as being stakeholders in this process, you would ask each of them just how effective they felt each of these strategies were.
And I don't know, we didn't discuss this, but it's something I was thinking, that some parents have a hard time with their role in this, and maybe in this way they could get some help or light could dawn for them as they work through this, in a partnership with Greg and the school.
Good, okay. And just to throw in here, while we're talking about this idea of these three stakeholder groups, I don't know how many of you are going to be here tomorrow for the discussion about consultation, but one of the models of consultation that is out there is called Conjoint behavioral consultation, and it's actually a model where the consultant, whether that be a social worker, counselor, a psychologist, somebody in that role, works with the parents and the teachers conjointly to come up with an intervention plan that cuts across settings. And I kind of, the way you guys are thinking about Greg kind of fits with that model, just in terms of trying to build that consistency across settings. How about evaluation plans from the other groups here?
We're gonna get the baseline from the functional assessment of behavior, and then we're just gonna measure it using our daily point sheet.
Okay, so you have baseline data from, presumably from an FBA, from a functional behavioral assessment, in terms of perhaps the frequency of some of these things, and then you're going to look at the point sheet in terms of,
To make sure, to ensure that the interventions are being effective, not taking into task, controlling the work, following the rules, and then, that collaboration.
right,
Also at home.
yep. That's good. I like that because you're incorporating something that's already part of what's being done. So you're already doing the FBA, so you have some data from that, and you're incorporating the intervention itself in terms of just by completing the intervention, you're collecting some outcome data. What you might want to think about in that kind of situation, if you were planning on doing something like that, is for a week or so in baseline, before you intervene, having the point sheet completed then. That wouldn't be tied to the intervention yet, but it would give you baseline data in terms of how they would look on the point sheet without the intervention, and then how do they look with a point sheet after intervention. So you have some consistency of measurement there across the phases, so might be something to think about. What did you guys?
I would say the same thing as far as the daily report card, using that in order to keep tally of how they're doing and being able to see, frequency of behaviors. Another thing that I was thinking was maybe just doing a teacher and a parent rating scale and doing that as baseline before interventions and then after interventions have been completed, and then you can compare.
Yep.
Because there you get qualitative data.
Yeah, and you get data that's separate from the intervention. I mean, the nice thing about using the daily report card as an evaluation measure is that you're already doing it, and again, if you collect it during baseline and compare it to after intervention, yes, and direct comparisons. The thing about that, though, is it's tied so endemically to the intervention, sometimes it can be biased in some ways. So getting some ratings that are again, from the same individuals, but in a different format, a different structure, might help with that. So that's another good idea to think about. Any comments from anybody in terms of Greg's case before we move on to the other cases? Go ahead.
For evaluation, would it be wise, would it be good to use the same information you use to gather for the baseline? Wouldn't it be, good, make good sense to just use that same test for like a pre and post?
Yeah. So the suggestion is to use, and I'll paraphrase here, at least some of the same measures that you're using at baseline, you want to repeat after a certain period of intervention, and I certainly agree with that, because otherwise you're perhaps comparing apples and oranges, so you have to have some comparison. Yep. What's that? Okay, so let's move on to case number 2, which is Heather, age 13. And here we have a little bit different situation. First of all, we have an older student, we have a girl, and we have a student who has a learning disability on top of the ADHD. And it appears that it's mostly a inattentive type ADHD. We used to call this ADD without hyperactivity. The current terminology is ADHD predominantly inattentive type. So in other words, she's not, the report here is not that we're talking about really impulsive or hyperactive behavior, but primarily inattentive behavior combined with a learning disability. So what groups had Heather to discuss? Okay, if you could start, just tell us the goals that you came up with.
The goals that we had were task completion, increased social skills, and targeting for math skills.
Okay, so task completion. The second one was what again? I'm sorry.
Social skills.
Social skills, meaning,
Just interacting with her peers.
okay, so positive interactions with peers, and then the third? And the
The
third,
math skills. You don't know where she is, but there's her specific disability.
so improving math skills. Okay, so, what's that? Go ahead. Did you say something?
Oh, no, I said that's where, her academic deficit is, so.
Right. Right, so you're targeting not only behavior, but you're targeting the academic performance. And again, as I said earlier, you would want to think, again, if you had more data, in terms of, what are quantifiable outcomes that would be viable goals for each of these things. So for example, enhancing math skills, you might be tied to a certain level of performance on curriculum-based assessment measures of math. Could be, here's the starting point, and here's the goal point at the end of the year that we're shooting for. That kind of thing you'd probably want to incorporate. What other group had Heather as their case? Yes?
Okay, we targeted the attention to tasks. We didn't target math skills specifically because it said that the inattentiveness goes across all over classes, so we didn't target that specifically. The second was to improve organizational skills because it said that she forgets some of the task instructions, so we thought maybe an agenda or somewhere where we can teach her how to write down what she needs to do, like help. And then the third was to engage in positive peer interaction.
Okay, so positive peer interaction, improving the organizational skills, and the first one had to do with attention. Completing assigned tasks. Okay, good, so we've got some similarities there, and were those the only two groups we had it? Okay, so given those goals, what kind of interventions, again, a balanced multiple mediator plan did you guys come up with?
We said the first thing, there needs to be consultation between the gen ed and the resource training teacher so that the plan is put up, and the counselor. We also considered for the social skills, maybe having her partake in a group to increase social skills with the counselor and other peers in that type of setting. One of the things that we considered proactively was to develop a task strip where the instructions would be broken down, which could also serve as a self-monitoring because she can kind of check off as she's completing the instructions. It can serve as a point sheet where she can get points and it can go home as information. It's kind of like all in one. It serves as a reminder, communication between parents, teachers, and then it can be exchanged for reinforcers at home or for activity reinforcers in the classroom.
Okay.
We were also thinking of task choice making. And also one of the things that I mentioned.
When you're talking about what, just explain that.
The task choice making, especially for the areas that are, more difficult for her.
Right.
Having different tasks where she can choose which one she's going to do.
Oh, okay, along the lines of what we talked about earlier.
Right.
Okay, so giving her a menu of, here are some potential tasks she chooses.
Right.
Okay.
Also considering that to include somewhere in there some frequent breaks because she does have that attention issue. So we included in there. And as instructive, peer tutoring for different activities during the day, but we were thinking the math also that would help her increase the social interaction plus tackle the academic deficit. Also because we didn't know exactly what the deficit was, we wanted to consider the computer generated for some of the drill and practice and additional instruction. And I don't know if I'm forgetting anything because I kind of like.
Gosh, you pretty much covered the waterfront there. Yeah, that's good. So you have teachers, parent, student, the peers, and possibly technology included in there. So you certainly have multiple mediators, and you've got a mix of proactive, instructive, and motivational strategies in there. So that's good. That's a good comprehensive plan. It might be in that kind of instance, you're probably going to need to prioritize resources and prioritize sequencing. Because that's a lot to bite off all at once. And I like the idea of the combined plan where you had kind of you were breaking the tasks down, right? And then there was a checklist associated with it, so there's a motivational piece to it and a self piece to it, and then reinforcement at home. That might be a place to start, I don't know, but I think when you're thinking comprehensively like this, you also have to think sequentially in terms of what's going to happen first and the next, et cetera, because it probably is going to be prohibitive to do all of these things all at once.
No, we thought of the task strip first, because it would help her with the organization,
Right.
breaking down the instructions,
Yeah.
and with the consultation between the two teachers so that it's put in both places.
Good.
So, on her desk, but it, that's a visual for her.
Good. So the only other comment I'd make is social skills piece you had talked about a counseling opportunity for her to gain those skills. And one thing to keep in mind is that the research on that shows pretty limited generalization.
And we talked about that.
You did talk about it, okay.
A lot of our students, you know,
From the autism world.
yeah, exactly, they do it great in the counselor's office.
Yeah, right there in that situation, right? But the transfer, unless you have people in the environment prompting and reinforcing the transfer, the generalization doesn't happen. And so that's something to think about.
I'm sorry, but what she would need more explicit instruction in the social skills and, you know, peer tutoring is good.
Sure.
But I thought maybe people should forget that she didn't really broke down kind of explicit instruction, and that's where she could get it, was with the group.
Yeah, I don't disagree with that. I'm just saying that if you're going to do that, if you're going to have that instructional piece in there, if you're going to bother to do that kind of work, you want to build a bridge for generalization.
So practice it within different settings.
Practice prompting and reinforcing in the settings of interest. Remember that I was talking earlier about the point of performance? So you want that somehow to bridge that social skills counseling or training to the point of performance on the playground, in the classroom, wherever. It's not going to happen automatically, so how do we build that in? How about the intervention plan you guys came up with?
Okay, so for the first ones, for completing assigned tasks proactively, we thought to increase some hands-on activities, some computer-based activities, to give better academic choices, and also some peer tutoring to increase the attention to task as well.
Okay.
So then motivationally, we thought that she could earn raffle tickets for every 10 minutes if she was on task. We decided that she was able to be on task for 10 minutes at a time, so we wanted to start with
So
that.
you're starting with where she's at now, that's very good.
So she'd be successful.
Yep.
And then if she was able to accumulate 3 tickets by the end of the period, that's, 70-ish%, still on the low end, but she could choose from a menu of reinforcers that she created and have maybe that last 10-minute period of time to do something that she chooses.
Great.
Then as far as mediators went, that would be teachers, peer, and technology.
Mhm.
And the assessment, first we'd look at the baseline before the intervention, and then we'd look at the data from the raffle tickets that she earned. So that we
Okay.
could compare
Right.
how effective it is.
Right, so you have multiple mediators in there. I like the specificity in terms of that token program that you described in terms of what, here are the time segments, and the fact that you are starting where she's at. And that's being reinforced from the beginning. So you're hooking her in potentially in terms of motivation, and then you can gradually increase those expectations. And you have multiple, I already mentioned multiple mediators, and you've got proactive, instructive, and motivational in there. In terms of the evaluation plan, you said what you were going to use?
That we would keep track of the raffle tickets that she earned, the percentage of raffle tickets, if you can earn 5 in a 50-minute period.
Right.
She'd be reinforced for 3 at the beginning, but we would keep track of that to see.
Yeah, so what you would want to do, similar to the comments before, you would probably want to, if you're anticipating that that's the intervention plan you're going to be doing, you probably want to get a week or so of baseline on those raffle, like without giving the raffle tickets, obviously, but what percentage would she have earned during that last week of baseline so that you have a consistent metric. That's going to be important in terms of evaluation. You have a consistent metric across baseline and intervention. What did you guys come up with in terms of an evaluation plan?
Wasn't a rubric.
So we didn't know what it was called.
The frequency.
Yeah, we were using, we have the functional analysis of behavior process
Yes.
here in Lehigh Public Schools, so
Yep.
we were thinking, I think it's called the time sampling. If you use that for your baseline,
Mhm.
and also use it for when you're implementing your plan, you can, right along the lines that we're saying every 10 minutes, I was thinking in a gen ed setting, every 15 minutes, to look up your objectives. Is she on task? Is she, and then you can do a checkup.
Observation.
Right, and then based on what your target was, use that during implementation to see if the plan is being effective.
Yeah, that's nice, because you have sampling throughout the day, and you have consistency in terms of what you're measuring in baseline and intervention, and it's tied to to at least a couple of your goals pretty
And we also
closely.
said, for the academic skills, for the math skills, I mean, that could be, just by her performance and, their student work, the evaluation, the academic.
So the products of her work, you could look at, it's very good. So you could look at, okay, what are the products, what are the permanent products that are happening during baseline, how much work's getting done? And now you have the permanent products after you intervene, how much work is getting done.
And then you have
Good.
that task sequence, the task.
Right, that's
The task
What
strip,
is
is that what you call
task
it?
strip? Yeah.
Yeah. Now, but you would only have that during intervention unless you,
But couldn't you use that, you could use that as your evaluation too, just not, see where
as long as you got some similar data during baseline, yes, you could. Because you have to be able to compare across.
But then you don't have it in baseline because she's developing it as an intervention, so.
Right. But the other stuff, you
Right,
can get
right,
across data.
exactly.
Okay, good. Any other comments on the Heather case example from anybody else?
I just had a thought, just from
Yes.
experience, that Heather's 13 and in the 8th grade, and something that complicates her life is her self-image and all of those girl issues that we don't think about. But they do come to affect girls in their performance and their academics and their daydreaming, whether they're ADHD or not.
So there may be gender
There's some
influence,
gender issues
and
that-
age, adolescence,
Yeah.
that interaction of gender.
And so in
adolescence.
any consultation, that should come up as a topic, I think.
Sure, so that certainly complicates the picture and needs to, I think that then you're thinking about what are developmentally appropriate and gender appropriate strategies that are gonna be, that are gonna be effective. So it adds that twist to it. Okay, let's move to Tommy, the 9-year-old who is identified with serious emotional disturbance or EBD. So this is a situation where we have somebody who is both ADHD and antisocial and conduct problems. So we have that additional what's called comorbidity. Again, not an infrequent situation, particularly for boys with ADHD. So you guys, yep. So goals, what goals did you come up with for Tommy?
Well, we talked pretty much the same. The social skills is an issue, academic performance is an issue, and he's aggressive. So it kind of overlapped the social skill, but we really wanted to focus on aggression, how he interacts with his peers.
So what would the goal look like in terms of that, of aggression?
That he would be more friendly and well-mannered, and would maybe teach him to use keywords like, may I, please, thank you, if he wants something, rather than, yeah,
Right.
thinking from the other kid. So being very specific and doing a lot of modeling and role-playing with the kids.
Okay.
But the big difference from our case to all the others is this is a self-contained class, so we're using some tier one innovations because assuming the other kids will benefit from some of those interventions as well.
Right, okay. So the aggression, let's just talk about that for a minute. So what you want to come up with for a goal there is something that is the opposite of aggression,
Conforming behaviors.
right, okay. So we probably want to operationalize some of those, and I think you did that, you gave some examples of what those would be. And we might even, as part of the goal, identify situations where aggression is more likely to occur. So we might say, when Tommy's on the playground,
An unstructured situation.
or in structured situations, such and such should happen. These should be the behaviors. So for aggression, because aggression, even in at least the SED classes I work with, is still a relatively low frequency behavior in the classroom in structured situations. Granted, there is aggression that happens there, both verbal and physical, but aggression as a whole tends to be a low frequency behavior. So the goals, in a relative sense, so the goals probably need to have some parameters in terms of the situations where you're looking to reduce aggression and build proactive social behavior. Who's the other group that you guys did with Tommy?
Pretty much along the same lines, but we kind of looked at the 3 main areas that he was having, because he's a lot of problems, but we chose attending to independent tasks, following classroom rules. He has a lot of problems with rules all over the place, outside of school, inside of school, so
hopefully getting him to follow classroom rules, maybe would generalize to societal rules. And then we just put interacting appropriately with peers, because he, in addition to the aggression, he also just does not have good interactions with peers. So starting with just appropriate, and then maybe moving on to better evolved relationships with peers.
Okay, good. And I think that, the following rules one is an important one, as you've identified. You might have to get more specific, given the severity of Tawny's problems.
Well, we were following classroom rules.
Right, but you may even need to get even more specific. For example, you might have to target certain times of the day or certain academic periods or certain subject matter in terms of at least your initial goals of being, following classroom rules at X percentage of following for math class.
So we came up with some objective targets for our daily report card, which that's what we set up later. But it's basically for the first goal, completing work with 75% accuracy in each class period. Following rules with 5 or fewer reminders in each class period, and displaying at least 2 social behaviors in the form of taking turns giving compliments or sharing toward peers within each class.
Okay, so those really could be your initial goals, could they not? I mean, you might not be attacking them solely through the daily report card, but those certainly are set up in those 3 areas. And the nice thing about it is they're targeted for specific periods of time. Because with a case like Tawny, you can get overwhelmed pretty quickly. Right? Because you're trying to eliminate all aggression, for example, all at once, could be a real stiff objective. So you already, go ahead.
She mentioned there's the benefit of that he's already in a very small therapeutic type of setting. So
Right.
implementation should be feasible, then maybe sometimes in a general range.
Presumably. Doesn't always work that way, as we know, but yeah, that would be the presumption. You guys had already started talking about your intervention, so let's talk about the intervention plan.
Okay, so we conducted a functional analysis of behavior, and we determined that Tommy is engaging in verbal and physical aggression toward peers to demand for their attention or to request for their attention. And there's one specific kid that he targets always. So some proactive things that we're going to do is, well, let me backtrack. Number one, we're going to post the rules on his desk so that he's aware of, before he knows exactly what he's expected. Also, we could post his targets on his desk so that he knows what he's working on in the daily report card. So those specific 75%, whatever, he can know what he's working toward. Also, we'll set up the room in such way that if he's gonna, so that he's not easily accessible to that one kid that he always targets to have physical aggression toward, so that we are able to maintain the classroom environment safe. But we are gonna, I guess, do some social skills training, and which I guess comes in the form of instruction, and teach him how to appropriately approach peers, how to request for attention appropriately, how to take turns, and how to share, how to give compliments, and other things that will build his social deficits. And I think we're gonna also give him some Voyager, some academic support.
If he goes to Dade County Public Schools, and he is below grade level, and it does mention that he is academically below, he will automatically get additional reading instruction. That's just part of it. So that is a direct instruction, it's just not something, it's built into his academic program.
It's already there, it's automatic.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So those are our, so I talked about proactive, I talked about instructive, and then so we're gonna set up a daily report card with those targets, and we are gonna work with his parents, because his parents are really great and they really wanna help him, so they set up.
Just like most parents.
So they set up, he chose his rewards, and he has a menu that he picks from, so when he goes home, if he meets his rewards with 80% accuracy, which we're gonna have happy faces and sad faces, and we'll circle each period for each behavior, and we'll tally it up at the end with him watching, and he could even tally it up if he's able to. And we'll set it at 80%, so if he has 80% of happy faces, then he'll come into contact with those home rewards.
Okay.
Also, practice strategy, when he comes into the classroom, we'll tell him, so what are you gonna work toward today? What are you gonna be gaining at home? And he can tell us a little bit about his favorite video game or something.
Okay, great. So there's a priming, that's called priming. When you, before a situation, you, in essence, have the student remind himself, in this case, of the rewards he's working for.
We're also going to ask his parents to withhold those reinforcers when they're not contingent upon the 80% accuracy, so that
he has a desire.
So they can only be earned when he's meeting those goals.
Exactly.
So you've got multiple proactive, instructive, motivational pieces in there. You've got the teacher mediated, parent mediated. What's that? Student mediated. So you have a student mediated piece.
Because he gets to pick what he's working for, and he gets to be part of the plan.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. I'll buy that. At least partially. But good. When you have multiple mediators in there, you've got at least two. Your intervention plan.
Okay. We started out with what you say, and it's true, it's not evidence-based, but the small group social skills with direct instruction and goals that it posted for the kids to achieve, and group feedback and mediator feedback on their skills development. But then to generalize that to class model for the teacher and implement it in the class, so that the social skills can be direct instructed.
So the teachers prompting and reinforcing the skills that are being learned.
And incorporate that
social
part
skills
of their daily, this part of the daily report card, along with the problems with staying on task and aggressive behavior, but part of the daily report card.
Okay, so you're setting the behaviors that you're instructing in the social skills program are being reinforced as part of the daily report card, is what you're saying.
And also, most of the classes such as this that we have already have a token system, a point system with a level system implemented.
Class-wide. You have a class-wide token system.
Class-wide discipline plan. And they can earn points towards privileges, and they also move in levels, and the levels have privileges that are attached to those levels.
Right.
So that would be part of it. And the rules posted, both in the classroom and on the desk, and a queuing system from the teacher to direct them back on task. Providing choices in terms of the task completion, the task accuracy.
So a menu of choices of assignments.
And breaks with opportunities for directed movement, let him run an errand to a teacher nearby or do something that he can be active, but it's a purposeful.
So you can earn breaks where he has some activity opportunities. Okay.
And computer-based instruction for the attention also. And for peer, pair him with a pro-social peer, if that doesn't turn into a mess. And for peer tutoring, yeah, in that class. So, and the home-based contingency system that targets the conforming behaviors and the task completion.
As part of the daily report card, right?
As part of the daily report card. And contingencies at home based on, being able to get a certain number of points. And, and the other thing we did was, yes, in order for the parents to be involved too, for social skills, to get them involved in some extracurricular activities, such as church groups or Boy Scouts or things like that would promote this, or play groups. There's structured kinds of play groups where someone's invited over in small numbers and the parents mediating.
And that's key. That's going to be strategic. You often hear the recommendations for kids with ADHD to get them involved in extracurriculars, and sometimes that can backfire if they're not structured and monitored closely and don't really match the interests of the students. So
Things
that's
like
good.
taekwondo work better than football or baseball because the group activities sometimes are more than
Depends on the student. I think you have to look at the student's strengths and weaknesses.
Whoever comes in the instructor and with that plan, so
Right.
they'll hear the plan.
Right, but the person supervising that activity should be part of the plan. Exactly. So you've got multiple mediators in there. You've got a mix of proactive, instructive, motivational strategies. I think we go back to one of the other groups for it was either Heather or Greg, one of the previous ones where we had multiple components to the intervention. Probably going to need to prioritize and sequence that because you're calling upon multiple resources, multiple people all at once, and you want to get strategic about that. The only other comment in terms of if you have a class-wide system already in place, as many self-contained rooms do, what you will often see for kids that are having more difficulty responding to that intervention, you may need to put some individual pieces on that.
Ratchet it up because he's already not.
Right, so you may think about the type of reinforcers, you might include a response cost component. There are a number of different things that you could add to the existing token system in that classroom that might individualize and up the ante.
Increase the frequency and salience of the
Reinforcers, right. So real quick, evaluation plans for Tommy.
We collected some baseline data of, so how much accuracy he usually has on homework assignments, how many reminders he needs in each class period for rules, and how many social behaviors he exhibits per period. So that we set up like a criterion, like that's how we came up with this criterion, and we'll just continue to monitor the progress with the daily report card so that we could see in certain periods if behaviors are higher frequency, if he's not earning those happy days in certain behaviors, we can kind of target see what's going on in those behaviors. In those periods. Or maybe he's really easily meeting some targets but not others, so that we could adjust them as needed and we could continue to monitor the progress.
Okay, good. So there's a number of things in there to point out. One is you're getting data obviously across phases, fairly specific data that's tied to your intervention, and you're actually using the baseline data to set your goals. So you're using the data to set realistic goals for the intervention, and that's key as well. What'd you guys look at in terms of an evaluation plan?
Report cards too, 80% completion work, we're gonna look at some grades on the assessments, we're gonna look at number of referrals, detention.
Referrals to like the...
Detention.
Okay.
And disciplinary action.
Yep.
Well, I had one here, maybe I can share much with you guys, because it occurred to me to do some kind of checking on positive interactions. Maybe having a checklist on how often you use may I, or please, or thank you, something like that.
So some key social behaviors that could be monitored both at baseline and after intervention to see whether the frequency changes. Okay, good. And the other thing is you're taking advantage of naturally occurring data like the office disciplinary referrals and other things along those lines. It's always a good idea to use those kind of data when you can to look at an evaluation plan because it's going to be certainly much more feasible for those data to be collected. Great. Any comments on Tommy's case example from anybody else? Yes?
I have a comment or a question. Can we consider what to do about the parents in case they're not nice and moody? Because some parents have such struggle. I've met some parents who want to shoot the kid, before they want to cooperate with you. And I said, well, you're the teacher, you take it. They're at their wit's end. And so they look to the school or the provider to be everything. And they really don't have the skills themselves. And the behaviors they model at home exacerbate the problem. So I don't know, somewhere in the mediation, I'd want some outside support.
Right,
for that.
from the
Maybe
parents and
therapy or
families in
something else.
terms of getting them engaged.
Yeah.
You got a
No, I was
comment?
just gonna say, it's just, this is awful to say, but my parents are either in jail or the guy who booby trap stripping. I work at a Title I Swiss kids at Florida, his parents are lower class, some have jobs, some can't get jobs. Migrant, whatever, it's just so different than this nice middle class model we've been talking about.
Sure. Well, the thing is that here's the thing, there are different strategies that may or may not be possible for engaging families. We talked about the conjoint behavioral consultation, and maybe other ways to get them engaged. But there are also instances where we have to be strategic about things, and it may be some instances where we have to just focus on what we can control and deal with that as best we can, and hope that with some progress that might get made as a function of that focus, we could eventually engage the parents in some way of seeing the success that hopefully has been gained by that focused effort, and then trying to engage them to capitalize on that success. I certainly don't pretend to have the answers to deal with these really complex situations that are tied into socioeconomic status, et cetera.
How can you do this without the family, basically?
Can you? Sure. Is it easy to do without the family? No. But we can, behavior, whether it's ADHD related or not, is sensitive to the environmental conditions that are present in a given situation. So yeah, the kid brings to the school the impact of what's happening at home. Okay, there's no doubt about that. You know, are they getting enough sleep? Are they getting enough nutrition? What kind of monitoring is happening there? They have access to alcohol, drugs, other things. There's no doubt that those stimuli, if you will, impact on their performance at school. But when they're here in the classroom, the most immediate things that we can control are the things that trigger and reinforce their behaviors. And we can modify those. There'll be limited effects given that we don't have family engagement, but there still is an impact of those modifications on kids' behaviors. It can still happen, but it probably places a ceiling on how far you're going to get. You had another comment or question before? As a follow-up? No, okay. I was hallucinating. I'm sorry. Oh, you did?
No, I had raised my
Okay.
hand only to suggest that, we're in dealing with with families that are complex and problematic in so many ways. We have, we need sort of a wraparound approach. The school does this bit, then a social worker might do another bit here, and and that. Because then you're not just talking about ADHD, you're talking about rage, about being neglected, and rage about, not being loved and responded to appropriately. Yeah, trauma. And so that's when a multidisciplinary team that's not just about the school becomes important. Because that's my
Yeah,
work.
now you
So I
mentioned
do.
like community, you could get the community involved with
That's right.
the social worker at the.
You could partner with
manager.
community folks,
Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah.
It's not impossible, it's very challenging, and you have a ceiling impact in terms of how far you're going to get. But that doesn't mean that some of these strategies wouldn't apply. It's just that they're going to be more challenging and more, perhaps more limited. Yes?
In my school, we have the listeners program. Is that something that we could involve them as a mediator? Are you familiar with that?
Excuse me, what's the listeners program?
It's a group of parents, they're volunteer, and they can come and meet with the students. They're not supposed to do any therapy or anything. It's just they go once a week, meet with that student, and check on them, make all the things in school. It's almost like a mommy kind of approach. Is that would be appropriate to get them involved? And they could be the ones, the piece that's missing in your case. They could be the one that's, hey, did you do your homework? Let me look at your notes,
I guess potentially, I mean, it would have to be, supervised and structured. But, there's a whole model out there for adult ADHD called coaching. And there's actually people whose profession is to be ADHD coaches. And you primarily see this for adults. By the way, there's not a ton of literature supporting this, but it has a lot of face validity. And these coaches work with the adults with ADHD in terms of setting goals for themselves and brainstorming strategies to address those goals and evaluating the outcome of them. There have been some models that have been designed for kids, for school children, using a coaching paradigm, whether those be peer-to-peer coach or adult-to-peer coach, adult-to-child coach. And, that maybe that coaching paradigm could fit here, I'm not sure. But, the key would be structured and supervised. Tell you what, you guys have put a lot of hard work in here. Let's take a break for about 15 minutes or so, and then we're going to talk about database decision-making and tie things up.